right, so we're going to move on to our main speaker, the program. So Michael Hiltzik, I mean, it's such an honor to have him. He's our LA Times columnist and blogger. And as I wrote about in the where you registered for this meeting, he's going to expand upon his 2021 end of year premise. And I love the quote, instead of unity and immunity, 2021 has brought us stupidity and insanity on an unimaginable scale in the categories of public health, education policy, fiscal policy, and investment options. We appear to have taken leave of our collective senses. In Michael Hiltzik's LA Times column this morning, he blames Congress for the IRS lousy tax service, where he shows the decrease of IRS employees benefits the wealthiest Americans from getting audited. Please welcome Michael Hiltzik, a man who can take it to the hilt. That is, he takes investigative reporting to the greatest possible extent. Here's Michael.
All right, well, thank you, Anne. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Okay, great. And welcome to all of you, whether you were here with me the last time I addressed this group, or you're hearing me for the first time. And here's hoping that the next time we'll be in person again, like we were the last time. And I guess if you're going back to in-person meetings in a month or so, that's probably the way things will work out. Anne had mentioned to me in passing when we were setting up this meeting that she hoped the Russia-Ukraine issue wouldn't dominate our conversation this afternoon. And I should have told her not to worry, because although I was a foreign correspondent in Russia for the Times, that was about 25 years ago now. So I really have no information, certainly not too many thoughts or opinions on what's going on down there just now. So we can set it aside. But those of you who follow my column know that I have thoughts and opinions on many other topics, as Anne mentioned. So I will try to cover a few of those over the next 25 or 30 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for questions about what I've had to say or what I haven't mentioned in the meantime. So Anne talked about the column that I closed out with last year, bidding farewell to what I labeled the stupidest year in American history. Now, I guess we could debate whether 2021 really does deserve the crown, but I think it's a defensible position. And I expressed the hope in that column that 2022 would be an improvement. And I have to say at this point, now that we are about 6 or 7 weeks into it, that thus far this year has lived down to my worst expectations, but it's still early, and so perhaps things will get better, and we're just about to enter the campaign season, and I'm hoping that we will see some improvement then. So let's cross our fingers. But let's review some of the points that I made in that column, because most of them, I think, are still pertinent today. I didn't want to spend too much time then on some of the truly spectacular outbreaks of asininity in 2021, such as the conservative movement's lionizing of Kyle Rittenhouse, who was self-confessed but acquitted killer of 2 unarmed men at a protest rally in Kenosha, and since then, since his acquittal, has gone on sort of the Fox News celebrity tour, or the openly anti-Semitic ravings of the former guy, or the ugly, dishonest attacks that forced the withdrawal of Sali Omarova, one of the most qualified nominees for a federal banking regulatory job in memory, that prompted her to, as I said, to withdraw from the nomination. Or the shameful behavior of congressional Republicans who, after cowering for safety during the January 6th insurrection, pleading with Trump to help quell the riot, have claimed ever since that the violence of the crowd was no big deal, just a normal, how did they put it, a normal protest. And then there's the posting of Christmas cards in the Christmas season by politicians showing their families, even small children, hoisting assault weapons, as Congressman Thomas Massey of Kentucky did just 4 days after a gunman killed 4 students at a Michigan high school. Well, instead, I spent my effort on some larger issues, which, as I said, are still very much with us. In May, I had asked whether we were experiencing a peak in investment absurdity. The examples were things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, non-fungible tokens or NFTs, along with meme stocks like GameStop, the prices of which were not tied to anything resembling a sober reflection about their issuers' business prospects or the overall economy, but to internet-fueled speculation and pure conjecture. Assets like these are priced in accordance with what's known as the greater fool theory. They have no intrinsic value beyond what you can get from a bigger fool than yourself. And the problem there, of course, is that sooner or later, the supply of fools, which is not small, but finite, runs out. And these sorts of assets have only proliferated since then. NFTs, for instance, are tradable digital files that confer no ownership to anything but the digital file, which may be an object that is actually owned by somebody else. Someone has parodied the NFT market by purporting to sell NFTs of photographs of individual Olive Garden restaurants. But it's the kind of parody that can get at the essential truth of the target. You don't get to own the restaurant, you don't get to own the photo, you don't get a discount on menu items or a guarantee that the photo is even accurate. You supposedly get to own something on the non-fungible Olive Garden metaverse, whatever that is, and you can try to find a greater fool to sell it to. The best clue that there's something weird and hinky about these markets is that the Trump family is going all in. Melania Trump, for instance, is selling NFTs of watercolors of herself. Now, interestingly, it turns out that in her big NFT auction, which supposedly brought in $175,000 for one of those watercolors, it looks like all the money came from herself or her representatives. Now, if NFTs were stocks or bonds, this sort of trading would be illegal, but it's not, at least not yet. But that's a warning, I think, to even minimally intelligent and cautious investors to stay away from markets like this. They're nothing but a hustler's paradise. The old adage applies about how if you're looking around the poker table and you can't identify who the mark is, you're the mark. And by the way, I have to say it gives me no pleasure to disclose that among the entities selling NFTs now is the Los Angeles Times. Now, no one in Times management asked me if this was a wise move or an honest move or would enhance the Times' reputation or hurt it. Maybe they knew what my answer would be, so they didn't bother to ask. Now, another major issue that I took on is, of course, the economy, specifically how we spend federal money and how we think about inflation. So let's start with Biden's Build Back Better program, most of which is still before Congress, is still being negotiated, is still being debated and discussed in Washington. Republicans and conservatives have never cottoned on to spending on programs that assist the middle class and the working class. So President Biden's program, which does exactly that, was designed to get their backs up. How could you attack a program that provides for universal pre-kindergarten education, assistance with childcare, caps on the price of drugs such as insulin, and better access to healthcare? Well, it's simple. You just raise the old bugaboo of inflation. That's been the approach of Republicans, and it's also the approach of Joe Manchin, a Democrat, at least a Democrat in name. The core of his position has been concern that Build Back Better would drive inflation higher. But that's just wrong. Not even former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, who sounded an inflation alarm about the pandemic relief package enacted earlier last year, thinks it applies to this measure. The provisions of Build Back Better are designed to be paid for, and they represent investments in the economy. So by those measures, they would be anything but inflationary. And that's not even counting the direct impact of Build Back Better on red states and Manchin's own state, West Virginia, which is among the poorest in the nation, and one in which government assistance programs are absolutely crucial. That's well understood on the ground. The United Mine Workers Union publicly urged Manchin to reconsider his opposition to the program because it would have, quote, a meaningful impact on our members, their families, and their communities. But so far, he hasn't really budged. Now, the truth is that the Biden economy is booming. Unemployment is at its lowest since the pandemic hit. Wages are on an upswing. 6.1 million jobs were created in just the last year, and economic growth in the fourth quarter of 2021 is currently estimated to have gone up at an annual rate of 6.9%. Each of those statistics is stunningly good news. The unemployment rate of 4.2% in late 2021 is a sharp reduction from the peak 14.8% reached in April 2020, when the pandemic was just beginning to bite. Average weekly earnings growth of 4.9% in November last year, over a year earlier, is among the strongest trends in wages in this century. And the growth in gross domestic product handily outpaces the rate of any year since 2000, and certainly the average of 2000 to 2019, which was only 2.08%. But yes, inflation. I asked last November in a column if there's any economic term that strikes more fear into the hearts of consumers and economists than inflation. And the answer is probably not. When inflation is rising even modestly, it becomes topic A in the press, on cable news, and over the proverbial backyard and at dinner tables. Inflation is commonly regarded as a ravager of family budgets, a destroyer of political fortunes, and at its most extreme, even a trigger for the rise of fascism. Any hint of inflation causes the equivalent of PTSD in the ranks of central bankers, economists, policymakers, and of course, millions of middle class and working class wage earners. But inflation is an inherently complicated subject. Its causes are tangled, its effects are variable. Consequently, it lends itself to confusion and misunderstanding. More to the point, consumer psychology may play an outsized role in fomenting inflation, for consumer behavior inspired by inflation fears can contribute to the same phenomenon by prompting more spending or less spending, as the case may be. But I think it's important to look at what's causing price increases and which prices are increasing and what tools are available to the average family to moderate inflation's impact. I suggest if you take a careful look, then inflation will appear less frightful than the headline numbers would have you think. Not every consumer is affected by inflation in the same way. For some, it can even be a blessing. It depends on what people treat as crucial purchases for the near term, on what they can defer, or forego entirely, and on the sources of their income. If your wages are rising faster than the cost of your market basket, as is the case for many middle class and working class people, you may even regard inflation as your friend. The main cause of the inflation we're seeing right now isn't a surge in the money supply, but a surge in buying of goods. So strong after more than a year of pandemic isolation that it has outpaced the ability of manufacturers to ramp up their systems to meet it. As a result, they're raising prices, in part because they know they can, and they know that even if they do, to a certain extent, consumer demand will still be strong. Consumers emerged from the pandemic lockdowns in a mood to spend and travel. Oil-producing companies have failed to increase output to meet resurgent demand, resulting in a sharp rise in the price of oil, and that means a rise in the price of gas at the pump. The port logjam and production slowdowns in computer chips have contributed to merchandise shortages, driving up the prices of cars and appliances, and workers' resistance to returning to lousy jobs has forced employers to raise pay. Now, I put it to you that these factors are likely to start to fade in the coming months, and some may already have run their course. And that suggests that the current inflation rate will moderate, perhaps falling almost as sharply as it rose through the end of this year and into the beginning of next year. Inflation is coloring voters' impressions of the economy because we've let Republicans turn it into an all-purpose economic boogeyman. This is a challenge that you, as Democrats, must meet. The Democratic Party, I've written, is pretty good at delivering what most voters actually want, things like supportive government programs and an inclusive society, and absolutely atrocious at making sure that voters know about that. So you have to go out and define the facts for voters before the GOP can get to them. Now, one other large issue I wrote about in my end of the year column was COVID. Pardon me. The pandemic is where the rubber of abject, indescribable stupidity really meets the road. The pandemic is the focus of the most obtuse and ignorant public reactions and state and local policy responses that I've seen to any crisis in my experience and maybe to American history. It's as if all the grown-ups have been beamed up and we on planet Earth are left at the mercy of Ron DeSantis. In any rational world, the refusal or failure by 50 million adult Americans to take a vaccine of known efficacy against a lethal disease would be inexplicable. But this is not a rational world, and the situation is even worse. Vaccine refusal is seen in many corners of the United States, not merely as the exercise of personal choice for personal reasons, and certainly not for medical reasons, but as a means of showing moral, political, and ideological purity and superiority over the vaccinated. A conservative opponent of anti-pandemic measures, writing from rural Southwest Michigan for the Atlantic Monthly, recently bragged absurdly and selfishly, "I am now closer to most of my fellow Americans than the people almost ridiculously overrepresented in media and elite institutions who are still genuinely concerned about this virus." The author of that Atlantic article may think that he's remote from virus concerns, but unfortunately for all of us, the entire world doesn't live on his street. It's not a remote concern at a hospital that was visited by CNN in Lansing, Michigan, which can't be much more than 80 or 100 miles from that writer's location, where, as CNN put it, The latest COVID-19 surge is as bad as healthcare workers there have ever seen. The conservative pundit Bari Weiss went on the Bill Maher show a few weeks ago and said, "I'm over COVID." My response was a column about this remarkably infantile outburst that pointed out that COVID is not over us. It's still a threat, especially to small children who can't get vaccinated right now, and immunocompromised people who are in danger even if they are vaccinated. So how did it come to pass that Americans who almost uniformly are inoculated against at least a half dozen serious diseases in childhood chose this moment to refuse a spectacularly effective shot against one of the most dangerous diseases to arise in their lifetimes? And by the way, the vaccine's effectiveness is scarcely disputable. The best estimates are that the vaccine has averted about 1.1 million American deaths from COVID-19 and more than 10.3 million hospitalizations just over the last year. Well, of course, the answer lies in politics, and especially partisan politics. Trump drew the line first, dismissing social distancing steps and refusing to speak up for vaccination, even though he was starting to take credit for the development of the vaccine. He established these anti-pandemic, these pro-pandemic steps as partisan choices, and his political flunkies have followed him over the cliff. DeSantis, the governor of Florida, has been a leader in this descent into the inferno. He's chosen to make Dr. Anthony Fauci, America's most respected authority on the pandemic, a target of partisan smears. He's appointed a vaccine doubter as his state's top public health official. What's the result of all this? The harvest is that Florida currently ranks 8th worst among states in its COVID-19 death rate, with more than 62,000 Floridians having perished from the virus. Of the 7 states with worse records, 6 are red states like Florida. If you hear Bill Maher say that states that had strict lockdowns and mask and social distancing guidelines, that they did just as badly as states that let it all hang out, call me. I'll show you the numbers that demonstrate that those claims are cherry-picked, and the truth is that there's an enormous difference in death rates among those states. Tens of thousands of deaths worth of difference. Corporate America, which has talked about stepping up on behalf of social issues in recent years, has not showered itself in glory either, by the way. Last December 18th, Boeing announced that it was dropping its requirement that all US employees must be vaccinated. Its explanation was that a federal judge had blocked the enforcement of a federal executive order that employees of government contractors be vaccinated. Now that's crazy. Nothing in the ruling required Boeing to drop its requirement, and the company announced its step back just as the Omicron variant was about to produce a surge in infections. Some judges aren't any smarter. Just the other day, a 3-judge appellate panel in the Fifth Circuit, operating out of New Orleans, ruled 2-1 to enjoin United Airlines vaccine mandate for employees. And that's a rule, an internal corporate rule that has produced a vaccine rate among United employees of well more than 90%. This was an unbelievable ruling by the 2 judges, one appointed by George W. Bush and the other by Trump. And I think it's worth quoting at some length from the lone dissenter, Judge Jerry Smith, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I've read a lot of court rulings in my day, and this was by far the angriest, most pointed, most dismissive dissent I've ever seen from a federal judge. Smith noted that the majority didn't even put their names to their majority opinion or approve it for publication. And I'll quote his conclusion here. Quote, "If I ever wrote an opinion authorizing injunctive relief without a cause of action, without a likelihood of success on the merits, despite the text, policy, and history of the relevant statute, despite the balance of equities and the public interest, and despite decades of contrary precedent from this circuit and the Supreme Court, all while inventing and distorting facts to suit my incoherent reasoning, I would hide my head in a bag. Perhaps the majority agrees. Why else shrink behind an unsigned and unpublished opinion? I respectfully and sternly dissent." Now, that's just one paragraph out of a more than 30-page dissent. So, phew. Tell us what you really think, Judge Smith. I'm sure it wouldn't surprise you to hear that COVID and the vaccines and vaccine mandates still have the capacity to send humans into apoplexy. For more than a year, I've been trying to explain how the theory that the COVID virus originated in a Chinese lab is utter nonsense. A yarn cooked up by anti-Chinese ideologues in the Trump State Department, and a hypothesis for which there is absolutely no evidence, and that the evidence that it jumped from the animal kingdom to humans through some very well understood biological routes grows every day, day by day, and is already more than enough to satisfy experienced virologists and epidemiologists. And every time I write that, I get responses from people parroting the same long debunked factoids spread by right-wingers and anti-vaccination activists. I feel sometimes like I'm suffering the tortures of Sisyphus, who, if you know your ancient mythology, he was the king who was condemned to roll a boulder up a mountain, and then every time he got to the top of the mountain, the boulder would roll back down again. And that's a situation that some of us who are trying to communicate the facts about COVID face. We do our best to roll the boulder up the mountain, and then we have to start all over again. And now, finally, let's talk about vaccine mandates. About a month and a half ago, I wrote a column that was headlined, "Mocking Anti-Vaxxers' COVID Deaths is Ghoulish, Yes, but May Be Necessary." I don't mind telling you all that this column elicited the most response I've ever received for anything I've ever written on any subject ever, but also the dumbest response. Not a single objector who reached me by email actually engaged with the point I was trying to make. The vast majority appeared to have a vocabulary of maybe 5 words, none of which can be repeated at a family Democratic Party Zoom meeting. Virtually none of them appeared to have even read the column, were reacting to something they'd read about it on Breitbart or Fox or some other right-wing source, or maybe they had seen the headline and stopped there. So what point was I making? First of all, I wasn't really advocating mocking anyone per se. I wasn't criticizing people who died after not having gotten vaccinated. In fact, those people I divided into 3 groups. As I wrote, some people have remained unvaccinated for legitimate medical reasons. They may be children for whom the COVID vaccines haven't yet been officially ruled safe, or people with genuine medical reasons for avoiding it. Others may have refused the vaccine because they've been deceived by the misinformation and disinformation being spread by the anti-vaccine crowd, including anchors on Fox. The deaths of those victims are truly lamentable. But there's a third group. This is a group of people who have voiced public opposition to the vaccines, not all of whom, by the way, are unvaccinated themselves. Some have couched their opposition in policy terms, and among them was Kelly Ernby, the Orange County Republican functionary who I was writing about. Ernby fell into that category. She asserted opposition not to the vaccines as such, but to vaccination mandates, although she was herself not vaccinated. She said in 2019, during an unsuccessful campaign for the state assembly, "I don't think the government should be involved in mandating what vaccines people are taking. If the government is going to mandate vaccines, what else will they mandate?" Well, of course, the vaccine has mandated vaccines for decades and decades and decades. The government mandates vaccines for 7 diseases involving 20 doses for school children, and probably has been doing so for as long as anyone on this Zoom meeting has been alive. And that's true in California, and it's also true in Florida, and it's true in Texas. The mandate Ernby opposed in 2019 was a law that tightened the immunization rules for California school children by eliminating exemptions based on, quote, personal belief, end quote. She was advocating a policy that could lead to the deaths of children. She also made clear that her opposition now extended to the COVID vaccine. In August, she posted a statement on Facebook supporting Huntington Beach firefighters who were fighting a vaccine mandate. And what she wrote then was, "The vaccine is not the cure to COVID, and mandates don't work." Now, the first of those statements was a straw man. No one has ever said the vaccines are a cure. And the second is flat wrong. We know that mandates work. They work absolutely. United Airlines can tell you all about it. My goal in the column was to ask, how should we treat these people who have crusaded against policies aimed at public safety, and then, like Ernby, paid the ultimate price for the folly they visited upon themselves and tried to thrust upon others? If we treat their deaths the way we treat most deaths, that is, as occasions for sadness or grief or sympathy or solicitude, aren't we erasing the harm they've done while they were alive? And should we erase that harm? I don't think so. I wrote that every one of those deaths, Ernby's and the other deaths of people who crusaded against public health initiatives, that every one of them is potentially a teachable moment. But how do we use them to teach? Nothing thus far has really worked. Maybe mockery and ridicule would bring the point across when reason and sobriety hadn't done the job. After all, mockery and ridicule are actually much respected in society. We use it all the time. It's an element in some of our greatest classic works of literature, from Don Quixote to Catch-22. Now, perhaps it offends you to speak ill of the dead. I have to say it has never really offended me when the dead deserve it for what they have done during their lives. Very early in my career, I expressed misgivings about writing an obituary that portrayed the subject, warts and all. My editor told me then, and it's been a watchword of my career ever since, that if the guy was a son of a bitch when he was alive, he didn't change just because he had died. And of course, most days you will find an obit in the newspaper that reminds you that the subject wasn't entirely an angel, or maybe wasn't an angel at all. What offends me is treating somebody as an angel on the way to heaven who, for entirely ideological reasons, not scientific or medical reasons, advises others to shun a vaccine against one of the deadliest pandemics of our lifetimes. Real life isn't like that, and real life can't be served that way. And if you'd like to delve deeper into the issue with me, if maybe you do have a disagreement with that point of view, feel free to tell me, because now I'll throw open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, you can raise your hand, or you can put a question into chat. I'm going to start with one that Reggie put in. Why don't you say it, Reggie, since it's yours? You have to unmute. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't remember what it was.
Okay, well, I can say it if you'd like.
Okay.
Okay. It has to do with, you were talking about the disinformation sources like Fox, Facebook, News. I mean, you were inferring them. So there's a lot of people that want them to be responsible for the results of their misinformation and some type of regulation. And do you see anything eventually being forced to have them take responsibility?
Well, we're in a bit of a limbo right now with platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and what have you, Spotify, to raise another recent case. Traditionally, these platforms have been more or less exempt from being held responsible for what is published by outsiders, by third parties on their platforms. The Los Angeles Times enjoys the same exemptions, and we use it. I hope you would agree we use it responsibly, but that's how we're allowed to basically publish op-eds and online commentary without necessarily feeling being held responsible for what's said, although we do try to police those comment threads for civility and to a certain extent for truthfulness. The platforms are beginning to move away from just being neutral carriers of opinion and statement and actually sponsoring it. And I think that's a situation that Spotify finds itself. It paid Joe Rogan $100 million, according to reports. So it's no longer just a neutral carrier of his misinformation and disinformation. It's a sponsor. It's put itself in a different category. I think we are basically working our way through as a society and through our government as to how we should treat some of these other platforms like Facebook and YouTube. I think at this point, what's most likely is that public pressure will force them to actually police their platforms a lot better than they have. And I think that's beginning to happen, although the larger the platform is, the more resistant it is to that sort of public pressure.
So Anne, if I could follow up on that. So what comes to mind is the case that just happened this past week with Sarah Palin's suit against the New York Times, and the suit was thrown out because her lawyers had failed to prove malice and knowledge. And I guess the question I have here is in the case of things like Fox News, there's certainly malice, although that's a high bar for proof, but there's certainly malice and there's certainly knowledge of the inaccuracy of some of the things that are being said. So I'm just wondering if there's any indication that somebody's actually going to take legal action.
Well, I think Palin took the best covered and most overt legal action that anybody has taken against the New York Times in at least 20 years. The rules thus far, or the rules that we have operated over for, I think, half a century or more, that it really depends on who the subject is and what the subject is and what the courts decided. Supreme Court decided in the Sullivan case that involved the New York Times' coverage of the civil rights movement in the South is that public officials, public figures, and public issues deserve the freest forms of expression that one can exercise, and therefore the bar, they set the bar very high for winning a libel suit. The bar they set was that you have to show that the speaker or the newspaper or whoever your target is published something with actual malice, and that means that they knew what they were publishing was false. They published it anyway, and that they did so recklessly. It was clear to legal observers from the very beginning that Palin could not conceivably have made that case, especially since the New York Times corrected the editorial at issue basically within a half a day of its publication. And the evidence at the trial showed that the writers and the editors of that editorial, the moment they realized that they had published a falsehood, took steps to correct it as fast as they could.
Okay, we'll move on to, am I saying your name, Mayren?
Yes,
Hi.
I had a comment and a question. The three challenges posing to the Democrats' coming election are inflation, COVID restrictions, and crime. And I think you alluded to two of them. You didn't mention crime. So on the message of inflation, I think Democrats have to do a better job of stressing the positive aspects of the economy, plus the steps that are being taken to curb inflation. On COVID, what you said, I agree on your messaging at the beginning of the pandemic, but the pandemic is now transitioning to an endemic. And I think Democrats are shooting themselves in the foot if they keep talking about the past and the restrictions. Their messaging should be, we vaccinated the people, there's immunity, and it's time to reopen the economy, because there's COVID fatigue. And you can see even in liberal places now, people are tired of wearing masks. You see these really graphic, powerful images of Democrat politicians standing in front of small children that have masks on their faces. Those really move public opinion. On the third issue, crime, again, very powerful images we see all the time. I saw it with my own eyes at Ralph in Palos Verdes. People just running through the store, robbing stores, and nothing that can be done about it. And that the message is that you elect Democrats, your stores are going to be robbed, and nobody can do anything about it. So I don't know if you have any suggestions for how Democrats can turn those, at least the crime aspect, around.
Well, a couple of points. First of all, I'm not sure that we can be entirely confident that we are moving into an endemic phase. I don't think this process is over yet by any stretch of the imagination. We could wake up tomorrow and be faced with yet another variant, and one that's more dangerous than Omicron. In any case, we see Democratic politicians are falling into place with everybody else, and they're getting much more liberal about masks. We're seeing that in Los Angeles. We're seeing it in California. We're even seeing it in San Francisco, which traditionally has been one of the more rigorous places in terms of mask rules. I think Democratic politicians are basically acknowledging that it's time to loosen all these rules, and they're doing so. In terms of crime, the figures simply do not really back up the assertion that crime is rising or is in any case out of control. What we're seeing is a surge in murders in some environments. We are not seeing an increase overall in property crimes. We are not seeing an increase overall in violent crimes. I think this is an old bugaboo that gets raised by the opposition all the time. We're just not seeing it in the figures. In fact, one of my colleagues, Sam Dean, did a very, very good analysis of the crime figures in San Francisco, where you were getting all of these reports of people running roughshod through retail stores around the city without being stopped, and of stores being closed because they couldn't basically deal with shoplifting. And basically what he showed was that the figures just contradict that story completely. And I think that's basically what we're seeing. We're seeing a story that's being put out there. We're seeing anecdotes being treated as data, and the data do not support the anecdotes.
Okay, I'm gonna, all right, Memran, did you have a follow-up or can I move on?
No, I don't believe, I mean, people realize, and I personally don't agree with that. I mean, if that statistic is true, it's definitely not coming across. And I'm a Democrat. I've voted Democrats all my life, and I see widespread discontent with the fact that people are released so quickly and stores are just getting robbed. And we've seen it in PD. I mean, not just my example, there are many other examples in our malls. And something has to change, at least the messaging that something is being done. Otherwise, Democrats are going to be blamed for this in the fall, and they'll be punished.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to Connie.
Hi. Do you see any components of Build Back Better passing? I saw Joe Manchin on CNN maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it seemed to me like he was moving the goalposts even further away. Do you have any sense of that?
I think there seems to be a feeling in Washington that some of it will pass. I don't know all of it, and I couldn't go through provision by provision to tell you which I think are more likely than others to pass. But I don't think the whole thing is dead. It may have to be broken up and passed piecemeal, and we'll see what the pieces are. But we haven't seen it yet, and we don't know yet.
So to follow up, I'm not sure how piecemeal would work, since I think it has to pass on reconciliation, and I don't know how many. I think maybe they have 2 chances for reconciliation this year. So I'm not sure how piecemeal would work, since that might be subject to the filibuster.
Well, you only have to go to reconciliation if you have something that can't get votes any other way. So depending on how they break it up, they may not need to go to reconciliation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to Jim.
Yes. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for your wonderful columns. I've been reading them for years, and they're a source of so much important information in order to make rational judgments in this mad world. But I just make 2 quick points. I feel that with regard to Build Back Better, one of the important pieces that I feel should have been addressed by the administration as soon as they took office was to implement SALT, because that was implemented to punish Democratic voters, and it's pretty painful. The second point I'd like to raise with you and ask your opinion about is inflation. Personally, my feeling is that if interest rates were raised more aggressively, it would dampen down inflation. It would provide earnings for seniors who have been earning virtually nothing. And it would encourage savings, which is a good thing for the economy, in my opinion. But what do you think?
Well, I can, starting with SALT, I think SALT is a very difficult lift in Washington. Everybody was happy when we had the state and local tax deductions, and then the Republicans succeeded in turning it into an attack on blue states. The problem with restoring the deductions is that that does look like basically a giveaway to wealthier people. And even though the level at which the deduction would kick in is much lower in terms of the economic level in places like New York and California, it's still in the aggregate, it's still most of the deductions go to wealthier people. So it's going to be difficult, all of the things being equal, to pass it just in on its own. You're going to need to actually put it as part of a much more comprehensive program that helps the middle class and the working class. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Yeah, the second question was interest rates. One
Oh, yes.
quick way to help to dampen down inflation is to raise the interest rates, especially in a regular basis. In other words, something that businesses can plan, so they'll know, for the next 18 months that every quarter that there'll be a half point increase or a quarter point increase in interest rates. And I see this as a very important for seniors who are trying to, earn some money on their savings.
Sure. Well, I think you're right about that. I think the problem with monetary policy is that it always creates winners and losers, and the tightrope that the Fed has to walk, and the Fed is, of course, the entity that really does manage prevailing interest rates, is how much do you want to raise rates so that you keep inflation under control, but not so much that you actually are affecting economic growth. And I think at this point, the Fed is really trying to signal that it will be judicious about this and not do too much too fast, because the one thing they do not want to do is undermine growth in the job market. So they want to be careful. I think you are absolutely right that the low interest rate environment that we've been living through for really at least through since 2008 has been great for people who are stock market investors, and terrible for anybody whose source of whose income is fixed income instruments of one sort or another, whether it's bonds or savings accounts. I mean, the return on bank savings accounts is, as anybody knows, less than pennies. It's hundreds of pennies. But I don't think that the Fed is in a position right now to raise rates to the point that those sorts of accounts actually begin to return returns that people were used to when rates were in the 5 or 6% range. I just do not see us getting there in this cycle. And without that, the return from fixed income sources is still going to be very low. So it's, as I said, it's a tightrope. What you want is rates that rise gradually so that inflation comes down from 6 or 7% to the 2.5% target. That's going to take time, and let's not forget that rate increases of that sort really work when the cause of inflation is an excess of liquidity and an excess of capital sloshing around. That's not really the problem right now. That's not what's causing the inflation that we see right now.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to Steve.
Thanks. Great columns and great ideas. And I do think we're not yet out of the woods. CNN had a thing about the BA2, which may be so bad that it will deserve a Greek letter soon. But I on the other question about crime, and well, like the videos of those people running around still sticks with us, only it's been 4 months or 5 months and we haven't had another one of those happen. But it does. I think, how do we make visually the positivity of what the administration is doing and the economy is doing? And I don't have the answer to this. That competes with those visuals, and how do we create narratives about that catch on compared to the oh my God, crime is everywhere. The question is, how do we frame a message that is as powerful in the positive as the negative? It's a long problem, but I think we need to be thinking creatively on how to do that.
Well, I agree with you. I don't really have an answer. I'm not an expert in political PR. I will say that it's much more difficult, I think, in the modern age to talk about the accomplishments of economic policy, particularly fiscal policy and public works, because what we really need right now is not to build more public works, but to maintain and fix the ones we have. So nobody is going to go out and build another Hoover Dam, where, you know, Franklin Roosevelt, even though he hadn't started the dam, could preside at the dedication of the dam and basically suggest that this was a New Deal project. Or Harold Ickes could go and open LaGuardia Airport and the Triborough Bridge. We're just not there. So it is more difficult, but I think we do need to see Democrats using the bully pulpit from the White House and the majority they have in the House, and basically doing their best to communicate the programs that they have put in place, and I think more than that, to make sure that people understand the damage that will be done in their daily lives if the Republicans once again take control. And I think there's probably no better way to do that than to really emphasize the damage that was done to the average American worker and the average American family by policies out of the Trump administration. And just ask, do you want to go through that again? And I think most people sensibly will say, God, no, we don't.
I do think we have projects like redoing the grid that could have ribbon cutting ceremonies, and building solar plants and solar farms out in other states than in California, things like that, that could have those images.
I'm gonna, I know we have another hand, but I'm gonna insert a question here. So we just did not have a vote about single payer here in California. I know you've written about it, and so one of the controversies was, can you do it as a state versus as a federal? And I did see you follow up since that no vote, or the vote didn't happen. I was wondering if you had an opinion about that.
Well, the answer to the underlying question is, if there is a state that could do it, it's California, because we are big enough to do it. The problem with single payer that was sort of kicked down the road by the proposals that were before the legislature in Sacramento, or that you need the federal government to cooperate by issuing waivers that allow California essentially to take over these federal programs. And there is a legitimate argument that in some cases, and to some extent, you actually need congressional action, that it can't be done simply by an order from the Department of Health and Human Services. So it's complicated, but on purely economic terms, it's hard for any state to go it alone, but California could go it alone if it could get all the necessary approvals.
Okay. One other thing, LA Times just had an article about, how it used, like, people are talking about the messaging here, and the message was, oh, everybody's moving from California. You even had a column about, businesses in Texas at one time. And then today's headline was, no, people really like it here in California. They really want to stay. So again, it's what is the data and what's really happening. So I found that enlightening.
Yeah, I've written more than one column on this topic because I keep having to go back to the data and explain what it shows. There is not a torrent of people leaving California. There's not a torrent of companies leaving California. If you go back through all these reports, going back more than a year, the same three examples keep coming up over and over again. And I have a rule of thumb, which is that, after a year of discussion, if you still have the same examples that you had at the beginning and still have them at the end, then that means that nothing is really happening. So what we hear is Oracle has moved to Texas because Larry Ellison moved out of California. We have that Tesla has moved its headquarters to Texas, and Elon Musk has moved to Texas. And then there's HP Enterprise, which is about half of what used to be HP, and they moved to Texas. That's basically it. The same three companies are mentioned over and over and over again. People do like living in California, and the financial and entrepreneurial ecosystem that created Silicon Valley is still the most powerful such ecosystem in the country, really the world. The venture funding that goes on in Northern California alone is more than all the rest of the venture funding that goes on in the rest of this country put together. This is still a very powerful engine. California has its problems. Housing is scarce, it's impossibly expensive, but people in the entrepreneurial economy really prefer the politics here. I don't understand how a company thinks it's going to attract young women or women of childbearing age, whatever their age, to move to Texas, where they know they cannot get the full spectrum of reproductive health care that you can get elsewhere. And in fact, you're treated punitively if you try to access it, that sort of thing. I don't understand how companies are going to attract young, committed workers if they suspect that their votes won't count. So I think, and frankly, I don't understand how a city like Miami can attract anybody, because it's frankly the climate is just miserable. The politics in Florida are miserable. They're getting weirder and more draconian by the day. I think people that have written op-eds about how I've moved to Miami because it's great, sooner or later we're going to start seeing op-eds about how I moved to Miami, but I'm coming back. That's my prediction. So yes, the figures have shown, and they still show, that California gets an influx of the best educated Americans, the younger Americans, and the most affluent Americans. And it's a problem, I think, that we lose others, that we lose less well-paid Americans and less well-educated Americans. But I think when you really look at the figures, the doom and gloom about California demographics is not warranted.
Okay, Walter, you've had your hand up for a while. Sorry about that. Can unmute. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Hi. I'm a big fan as well, but in this age of climate limitations, I read all the stuff about perpetual growth. Growth is always the touchstone for every argument about whether it's to build another rail line or jobs and so forth. But in this era, isn't it possible to have prosperity without growth? What's your position on that?
Well, it depends on what sort of growth you're talking about. Another rail line, I think if you're talking about the high-speed rail, I'm not sure that's an example of growth. I think that's an example, if it can come to pass, of a solution to growth. And that is by opening a transit corridor that can take some of the excess that can no longer be managed by our airports or our freeways. So I think
I
California
agree.
has been
I meant
looking.
the jobs. I meant the job growth is always a justification for some of these big capital projects. But I'm really more interested in the whole notion of prosperity without growth.
Well, I think everybody is always afraid of stagnation as the opposite of growth. I think you were probably correct in thinking that the high growth notion and the high growth era that we lived through in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, I don't think that's sustainable anymore. But I think that California has actually managed its growth, except, if you leave aside housing, we've managed growth in terms of our water supply and even our energy supply pretty well. And certainly in water, we've done very well. I mean, the population has grown tremendously. Water usage has remained fairly flat, and that's critical because water is a great limiting factor. I think we've been talking about limitations to growth in California for several decades, going back to Jerry Brown's first and second terms, and not even his last terms. He was always very cognizant of the fact that cheap growth was no longer going to be available. I think with climate change, we are facing an era of limits of a sort that we have not had to deal with before, not quantitatively and not qualitatively, and we're going to have to do that. I don't think it necessarily means that population growth can end, but I think it means that the incursion of population growth into parts of the state and parts of the environment where it's been happening for years can't happen any longer. And I'm talking, for example, of the urban wildland interface, where the incursion of residential property has really interfered with the ability to deal with wildfires and other consequences of climate change. So I don't want to be too Pollyannish, but if any state can come up with solutions to these sorts of problems, it's probably California. That's not to say that we will, but that we're probably, we have the intellectual and to a certain extent the financial resources to do it better than most other states.
Thanks.
Thank you, Walter. I mean, you have Schwarzenegger out of his Hummer in an EV. So we have something positive. We do have a question here. Maybe it might be our closure. Carol Mahler, did you want to say it or you want me to? About your predictions?
Well, we hear that on the one hand, when all of these restrictive voting rules go into effect, that the Democrats are going to lose the House and the Senate. And then on the other hand, we hear that the Democrats have made strides and things aren't so bad. And I just wondered from your vantage point, how you see November happening.
Well, I tell people that I got out of the business of political prognostication on November 8th, 2016. So I'm wary of making predictions. All I'll do is I'll observe, first of all, that the Democrats seem to have done better than anyone expected in the battle against gerrymandering in this last cycle and in redistricting in many states where the fear was that redistricting would be a Democratic disaster. That doesn't seem to have happened. Voter suppression is obviously a great concern. I've certainly seen studies that say that voter suppression works only on the margins and not as much as you think, but it's possible that there will be enough of it to swing certain elections. All I can say without fear of contradiction is that California is one of the states that really does put into effect and honors the idea that everybody should be able to vote. We have some of the most liberal voting rules and standards of any state in the union, and it works. And we saw that most recently in the recall. I think we see it in every election. I've sometimes said that we do it to a fault because the initiative process does not always end up with the best result from a public welfare standpoint, but we really do not place obstructions in the way of anybody who's eligible to vote and wants to vote. And I think that's something that we should be proud of in California.
Okay, Melissa, your hand's been up from before, so I'm assuming that was from when you were up before and didn't take it down. So that was my assumption.
That's
So,
correct. Sorry.
okay, yeah. Okay, so we're gonna move on, and this is, Michael, if you have any closing remarks, we've had you on for quite a while, and it's your Sunday afternoon, and it's been a pleasure, so.
So I think I basically talked out. So I appreciate all the questions and thanks for the compliments. They're much appreciated.
Oh, I
And
guess we
thanks
have,
for hanging in there.
do we have a last one here from Keith or?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to reintroduce myself. My name is Keith.
Okay, wait a minute. I haven't finished with Michael, so.
Oh, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
Sorry about that. Okay, so Michael, it's been a pleasure, and I hope this is a tradition for you, and we'll keep reading. We'll keep reading you. So
Okay, that's good.
and
Thanks.
keep going. Oh, I just had one last thing. You've moved to the second page of the LA Times. What is your plan? I mean, what is their plan for you? Just maybe.
All right,
you could-
let me, thanks for mentioning that because I want to put in a pitch here. My column moved to the second page. This was actually a pandemic related move, and it was essentially a way to deal with space cutbacks that we were dealing with that were affecting the business section where the column normally appeared. I'm very comfortable with being on page 2. I think that it gives me more exposure, but I really want to emphasize, and this is something that I try to mention every time I have a meeting like this and give a talk like this, is that if you are only reading my columns in the newspaper, whether you're getting it in print or getting the facsimile edition that comes to you by email, you're missing 60% of what I write, because I write columns, sometimes 5 times a week, sometimes even 6, maybe 7. And most of those, except for 2, sometimes 3 a week, they appear online but don't go into print. So I would ask you and urge you to take advantage of the online newspaper at latimes.com. You can find my columns there all the time. You can find all the columns that I've written going back years. And if you are a subscriber, you have access to that. You just have to, I think you may have to go through, some simple formalities to have access to the digital, to the website. But that's where, not only is that where most of my columns appear, but in almost every case, the print columns are abridged versions of the same column that appears online. It may have appeared online the day before or 2 or 3 days before, but in much longer form. I've got to, when we're formatting the columns for print, I have to cut things out. And as much as I hate it, I have to do it. But the full columns are always online. And I really hope you, it becomes part of your lifestyle to read them there.
Thank you. I'm so glad we clarified that. Very, very good. Okay. Anyway, have a great afternoon, and we're going to continue our meeting. Thank
Thanks.
you.